I love the number 3. I know that's not the way you expected me to start, but I basically have 3 minutes to wrap up the career of a phenomenal educational psychologist. So what I've decided to do is mention 3 things so that I can stay within that time limit. The first one I'm going to mention, even though Joanna and I have been long-time friends, I've never mentioned to her. When I was a doctoral student at the University of Kansas, I was pretty much of a library rat, Xeroxing every article I could find on literacy. And I came across an article by Joanna, and I would read through them just skimming to see if I wanted to Xerox that. And I saw her article and I stopped dead. And as I read it, I thought, this is the real deal. And the reason I said that is because not only did she look at something that advanced our knowledge theoretically, but it was impactful. It made a difference in the lives of kids that she was working with and over time. I can't think of anything better to say about somebody's research than that. The second thing actually relates to service. So if you take a look at this row right here, and I'm particularly pointing them out, you have 3 people who have been the past president of Division 15. You've got an editor of educational psychology, and you've got 3 editors of Journal of Educational Psychology, 2 current and 1 coming up. Now, Joanna has filled both of those roles, and a lot of other ones as well, in addition to all of that great work that she's done. Let me tell you, it's incredible how much time it takes. You know, we sometimes view them as saints, and we sometimes view them as murderers row, you know, when we don't get the outcome we'd like, when we submit an article to a journal. But, you know, there's something to be said for the level of service that Joanna's given to the profession. The third thing is even more personal. We had a grant together, a center called Center to Accelerate Student Learning, and it involved Joanna, Karen, Doug and Lynn Fuchs, and myself. And I had met Joanna previously a couple of times. She probably won't remember, but they were very short meetings. And this way we got to know each other really well. So the outcome of that for me is I realized, 1, how really smart she is, but maybe more importantly, what a great person she is. You know, she never had to be the one out front, in the lead, look at me. Always was willing to cooperate, always made everybody else's research better. So I want to say thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I can't live up to that introduction. Thank you very much. But I want to say, first of all, what a great honor it is to be here. When I was a young assistant professor, I was on the committee to choose a Thorndike winner, and I knew from that point on what a big deal this was, and I really feel it's a big deal, and I'm very grateful to the division and everybody. I've been retired for 6 years. I no longer have an ongoing research program. And to talk about my most recent research focus, teaching text structure to improve reading comprehension, would be to take up the same topic that Bonnie Meyer discussed last year in her presidential address. No one could top the job she did on that topic. So I have decided to tell a broader story of how I became an educational psychologist and what it has meant to me. Of course, no single story by any one person can cover the great expanse that defines our field. Only when all of our individual stories are considered together can we see the enormous impact that educational psychology has had across its myriad specialties and areas of interest. Probably an early Myers-Briggs vocational aptitude test would have predicted how I have spent my life. When I was a child, playing school was my favorite activity. I didn't need any special equipment, just the books and paper and pencils that I spent most of my time with anyway. And they say you can tell a lot about a person from their sense of humor. One of my favorite childhood jokes was about the little girl whose teacher admonished her for not reading with expression. The teacher says, "This book is about a duck, and here, at this point, what you are reading is what the duck is saying. You should say the line the way the duck would say it." So the girl dutifully rereads, and the duck said, "Quack, quack." My Myers-Briggs profile would probably not have prophesied a successful career in comedy, but reading specialist would definitely have been something worth suggesting. I majored in psychology in college. My department was very behaviorist, and I loved it. I fully subscribed to the notion that the brain was a black box that did not need to be opened. I learned that mind was a 4-letter word. I did my doctoral work in experimental psychology at Yale during the years when grand theories of learning were still in vogue. The premise was that the process of learning was universal for all animals, including human beings. Learning did not necessarily imply improvement. It meant any change in behavior, wanted or unwanted, that was not due to physiological conditions such as fatigue, aging, and the like. That definition tells you all you need to know about where my doctoral education fell on the continuum from theoretical to applied. When I started teaching at the University of Pennsylvania back in 1961, I was thoroughly imbued with behavioral learning theory and with the experimental method. But what I didn't have was a topic that I wanted to investigate. I knew I wanted to apply what I had learned to an educational issue, but that's all I knew. Then a couple of good things happened. For one thing, I spent a summer at Stanford at a conference designed to interest recent PhDs in educational research. The stellar lineup of senior researchers who came through showed us how educational issues could be addressed profitably by people who had been trained in the social sciences. My fellow participants became an important reference group for me throughout my career. That summer program made me feel like a bona fide educational psychologist. The second thing that happened was that I attended a symposium given by Eleanor Gibson and her students at a meeting of the Eastern Psychological Association. Gibson specialized in perceptual learning, and she had started doing research on reading. She had developed a set of simple forms that followed the rules of formation of the letters of the alphabet, which she used to investigate how children learn to recognize words. She and her students presented neat little experiments. I had a shock of recognition. She was doing work that reflected all the features of good research that I had been taught in graduate school. And her studies addressed a genuinely important problem and were going to help people. Later, I found out that Gibson had gone to Yale, and it made sense to me why I was so taken with her approach. That was how I became involved with reading and with project literacy. This was a small research consortium housed at Cornell, where Gibson taught, which included psychologists, linguists, and others, whose goal was to conduct basic research on reading. The orientation of project literacy toward long-term goals did not stop me from diving into the fray as the debate raged about how best to teach children to read. Rudolf Flesch's Why Johnny Can't Read, Damning Progressive Education and Endorsing Phonics, was published in 1955, but a decade later it was still getting lots of press. Sometimes the debates were more like battles. Jay Samuels and I participated in many panel discussions, teaming up to argue with Ken Goodman and Frank Smith. It was extremely perturbing to discover that so many people were willing to draw conclusions about the effects of instruction without bothering to look at data. I've been there already, my goodness. Okay. In the mid-60s, it was accepted wisdom that training in various perceptual and motor skills would accelerate the course of reading acquisition. Tests like the ITPA, the Illinois Test of Psycholinguistic Abilities, evaluated students' visual and auditory skills. Students who lagged behind their peers were given a variety of multisensory tasks as remediation. But these tasks bore no relation to the act of reading. I did studies on perceptual and motor skills, but I made the point that remediation techniques in the perceptual motor domain were not helpful unless they were embodied in tasks whose content was actually reading related. Indeed, it turned out that the perceptual motor skills curricula that were so popular did not show the expected transfer to reading. Unless you provided training specifically on components of reading, that is, on the differentiation among actual letters, the training would not be effective. Another type of study I did involved the analysis of intuitively based assumptions made by writers of instructional materials. These were brief experiments. They could take as little as a single session. I call them laboratory analogs. Linguists, for example, recommended that only single letter sound correspondences be presented to the beginning reader, so that in the case of multiple correspondences, such as the soft and hard sounds of C, it was important to teach only one of the correspondences at a time. Using a modified paired associates paradigm, I taught children multiple letter sound correspondences by either of the two methods, successive or simultaneous. It turned out that on all measures, the students did better when both phonemes were presented together throughout training. The point of such studies was to get empirical evidence on the many small questions that come up during the design of instruction so that training programs would be more legitimately based. I taught at Penn for 10 years and I moved to Teachers College, Columbia, in the fall of 1971, having been recruited to join its Learning Disabilities Institute. The focus was on a newly identified group of children who were at least average in intelligence, but who were not succeeding in school because of problems in reading or math. At the time, there was a good deal of optimism that research would quickly come up with solutions to the problem, and that, for example, the children who were having difficulty with reading would, after the right kind of instruction, master decoding and would have no further problems. I decided to take the plunge and move into instructional research. I had never done a true instructional study before, and I soon found out how much work that kind of research entails. My qualms about not being able to determine who was learning disabled were assuaged by the fact that the schools decided the matter. I told myself that if the instruction I designed was successful, then it was likely to help any child who was having difficulty, not just those hard-to-define children with learning disabilities. When I began my project, researchers believed that children with severe learning disabilities could learn academic skills, but they were not very sanguine about the likelihood that these children would be able to transfer what they had learned to new content. I took that as a challenge. I developed a supplemental remedial program for elementary school children with serious disabilities. My rationale included the points that first, although there had always been the assumption that the educational treatment most effective for special populations was in some way different from the treatment appropriate for the general population, there was very little evidence that that was the case. And second, that children who have trouble learning, whether learning disabled or not, were likely to do better with a structured approach. Excuse me. In 1963, a paper by Daniel Elkonin, an educator in the USSR, appeared in English translation. This is the earliest citation I have found on the importance of training phoneme skills in isolation in the absence of alphabet letters. Elkonin proposed a procedure to train children to differentiate the sounds that are the components of the speech stream. It involved diagrams and discs with no labels on them to represent and count off phonemes and words. This work made a big impact, and by the mid-70s, there was a substantial amount of research, prediction studies and developmental studies that indicated how important these skills were. My instructional program was based on this line of work. I call the program the ABDs of reading, referring to the skills taught: analysis, blending, and decoding. Children were taught the concept of analysis first at the level of the syllable and then at the level of the phoneme. At first, they saw no letters, just Elkonin discs. Actually, we used small wooden squares. Only during the second half of the instruction did children see letters. The children were taught to analyze and blend combinations of 2 and then 3 phonemes, including nonsense combinations. Then more complex patterns were introduced, ending with 2-syllable CVC words like catnip. First, I tried out the program. 17 classrooms used the program and 16 did not. Those who received the program did better on all our measures. Then I did my study. 40 teachers were randomly assigned to either the program or to a no treatment control, and each teacher taught a small group of 3 to 5 students. The important question this time was whether the children were able to transfer to content not included in the instruction. Could they use their decoding strategies on novel materials? When I designed this study, I knew of laboratory studies that had demonstrated such transfer by Jay Samuels and Joe Jenkins, but those studies had not been done with children whose mean IQ was 84. Moreover, in a classroom study, it was much more difficult to monitor the instruction carefully enough to be sure that there is no direct training on the content to be used to assess transfer. What we did was to go through the materials before the study began, eliminating page by page certain trigram combinations of phonemes chosen randomly from the games and worksheets. We monitored via classroom observations and teachers' reports. Then during the training, when a treatment program reached each of 2 points in the program, a short test was administered to each child individually. Small groups of children in the classrooms of the no treatment teachers provided yoke control for testing. The groups who received the training performed substantially better on the untrained items as well as on the trained items on both real and nonsense words. Thus, transfer did occur, and the program did succeed in teaching the process of decoding. I felt great satisfaction that this study showed that, yes, children with serious learning disabilities could learn to decode, and they could transfer. I'm sure it was due to the nature of the instruction. It was explicit, structured, and systematic. When I started this work, the field was in the throes of losing its faith in visual perceptual training programs, having acknowledged that they weren't working. Interest switched to auditory skills, but people soon stopped using the term auditory skills and started to talk about language, adopting the term phonemic awareness to emphasize the notion that phoneme skills involve an awareness of the abstract units of which speech is composed. I was stubborn, however, and I entitled my article, Teaching Decoding with an Emphasis on Analysis and Blending, because I was really not sure that awareness had much to do with what the children were learning, and I still don't. Other researchers were interested in my work, but when I showed my program to a couple of publishers, they weren't very interested. It was many years later when people finally recognized the importance of phonemic awareness in decoding. In fact, as you probably know, it came to be seen in many quarters as a necessary prerequisite of phonics instruction. By the time that happened, I had shifted out of beginning reading and was involved in other things. I turned to the new ideas about comprehension. The cognitive revolution of the 1950s and 1960s had provided a new model that allowed us to tackle issues that had not been amenable to study using a behaviorist framework. Its ideas were truly revolutionary. Reading comprehension was described as a complex set of cognitive processes in which several sources of information are integrated. Not all the information needed to understand a text resides in the text itself. Rather, readers constantly make inferences to fill in gaps. It could be said that they're actually constructing the text. Another similar constructivist approach, reader response theory, was also introduced, complementing the new psychology. It posited that each individual reader derives a unique meaning from a given text because each reader comes to that text with a unique knowledge base developed over the course of their life. Research inspired by these new theories focused initially on background knowledge, demonstrating that the more familiar people are with the topic of the text, the better they will retain and understand it. Michael Presley and others developed a research paradigm in which expert readers were asked to describe what they were thinking while they read. The protocols indicated that good readers employ conscious, intentional strategies. These could be taught. Students could be made aware of their own thinking processes so they could monitor their understanding. They could construct a mental image, for example, or prime their background knowledge by reflecting on what they already knew about a topic before doing any reading. This work led to a monumental shift in classroom practice. It became heavily constructivist. Teachers began to emphasize the importance of students' own individual interpretations of a given text. The research continued to focus heavily on the nature of the reader and how that affected comprehension, with scant attention given to the nature of the actual texts that were offered in instruction. I started to brood about the extremely high value that educators and some researchers were putting on these constructivist ideas. Was this really an appropriate instruction for young children or for students with disabilities? I did a study in which I compared a group of 14-year-old students with learning disabilities who were some years below grade level on reading comprehension with a group of younger, non-disabled students matched on reading comprehension level. The participants listened to a story as it was read to them. They did retellings, made predictions, and stated the theme of the story. Both groups did equally well on our measures. However, when we established a more sensitive scoring criterion, assessing what we called incipient theme awareness, the students with disabilities did not do as well as the others. In addition, the students with disabilities imported more irrelevant and implausible information into their retellings, suggesting that they had not built up an accurate representation of the story. I concluded that their inaccurate representations interfered with their ability to get the point of the story. Readers must learn not only how to integrate information from diverse sources, but also how to inhibit information. Otherwise, their grasp of the gist of the text will be lessened, and so will their ability to draw implications and conclusions. To my mind, these findings should lead people to beware of leaning heavily on constructivist comprehension instruction for children with learning disabilities, or for that matter, for any struggling readers. In the 1990s, the U.S. Congress called for the formation of the National Reading Panel, which was mandated to review the existing research literature on reading comprehension. All instruction, actually. I was on the panel as a member of the comprehension subgroup. Only a small number of methodologically sound comprehension studies had been published at that time. Most of them were more or less related to strategy instruction, especially the strategy of enhancing background knowledge. So the report focused on strategies. And when the Reading First legislation came along, it put strategy instruction front and center. Schools adopted this approach in a big way. No one seems to have paid much attention to the section of the NRP report that pointed out how difficult it was to do strategy instruction effectively. This approach is quite prominent in instruction right now, and there is increasing emphasis on the background knowledge strategy. Unfortunately, student performance did not improve as a result of this strategy reader-oriented instruction. And this untenable situation led to a new major policy statement, the Common Core State Standards, which came out in 2010. Rigorous tests and teacher accountability were introduced. All of this precipitated a good deal of consternation, and there was more to come. 2 years later, a new instructional method was recommended, close reading. In close reading, a text is not simply read, it is studied. It's serious business. Teachers are to ask questions whose answers are based strictly on information that can be found in the text. Digressions into personal experiences or other tangential topics are not permitted. This method is far removed from the looser, reader knows best constructivist approach. The Common Core suffered a huge backlash because of its stringent testing and accountability provisions, so that its impact was blunted from the beginning. It prompted, however, an important new research emphasis, a focus on the text. Evaluating text complexity and figuring out how to select and sequence text for instruction are popular research topics at the moment, as for example, the work of Art Gracer and Danielle McNamara and Freddie Hebert. And research on specific topics of language that had been neglected, like morphology and syntax, are now steadily moving ahead. My own interest concerns the method of close reading. There are plenty of critics of that method. Some worry about the strictures that this method might place on classroom discussion and argumentation. However, I have a positive view of close reading because my research interests have centered on young students and students who struggle, students who do well with instruction of this sort. When teachers don't do something like close reading, they do other things. For example, they spend more and more time reading to children before the kids have a chance to read the texts for themselves. When this happens, you can be sure that less and less serious reading instruction is taking place. I think that this situation is getting worse. Some educators are now using the term background knowledge when they simply mean teaching general content, teaching it for good reason, because there are far too many children who come from homes that cannot provide them with rich experience. But the idea of offering this kind of instruction with the belief that in the long run it will help improve their reading comprehension, because lack of general knowledge is what distinguishes poor children from their more advantaged peers, seems to me ultimately wrong-headed. It's wrong-headed because using background knowledge as a teaching strategy is another of the many ways in which the focus of instruction turns away from the actual task of reading. Consider the practice in beginning reading of relying on context clues or picture clues. This teaches the children to arrive at word identification by means other than decoding, which is the very expertise that they must develop for proficient and fluent reading. Similarly, teaching readers to rely on background knowledge entails guiding them to arrive at meaning by means other than learning to construe the many and various and complex language structures found in text, which is the expertise that they need in order to read with comprehension. In any case, all of this is my preface to telling you how I came to do my research on teaching reading comprehension via text structure in the primary grades. I wasn't convinced that strategy instruction was the best approach to take, in large part because of its emphasis on conscious cognitive processing. The idea that young children should be taught to reflect on their own mental states seemed bizarre to me, and I felt strongly that beginning readers should have a solid focus on the text itself. First, I developed instruction for narrative text, teaching students to go beyond plot level, as outlined in story grammars, to an understanding of the more abstract story theme. Then I turned to expository text and the seminal work of Bonnie Meyer, who had identified 5 basic structures that were important to teach: description, sequence, comparison, cause-effect, and problem solution. I liked her approach and thought that what she was doing might be a good focus for early instruction. Part of my motivation, I should tell you, was to demonstrate that primary-age children can deal successfully with formal instruction in comprehension. There had been a spate of studies by developmental psychologists who were all for having young children listen to their teacher read information texts, but who were dead set against offering genuine instruction. I saw no reason to deprive these kids of real instruction if they could handle it, and I thought they could. I developed my intervention for second graders who have enough reading ability to be able to focus on structure. I call the intervention Close Analysis of Texts with Structure, or CATS. I first used this title in a 2004 paper well before the Common Core came along with its close reading. The intervention is designed to serve as supplemental instruction for general education, especially for children at risk for special education placement. The content of the intervention covers a typical second grade social studies curriculum. Units focus on 5 historical communities: Native Americans, colonists, pioneers, immigrants, and contemporary urban residents. Students learn about the homes, schools, jobs, and other features of these communities. The lessons include common instructional components, trade book reading by the teacher, followed by discussion, vocabulary, and writing. The core of the instruction consists of the close analysis of short paragraphs of well-structured text. I believe that a deep study of a series of clear examples of a given structure will lead to a strengthening of the mental representation for that structure. These paragraphs change gradually over the course of the lessons, becoming longer and more complex. The first sentence of each paragraph provides information about its structure type. We teach students to use clue words, structure-related questions, and graphic organizers. They circle the clue words, they underline critical pieces of information, they cross out sentences that provide no information relevant to the structure, then they summarize the paragraph both orally and in writing. We did 5 randomized control trials, each one focused on a single text structure. Each of these 5 trials was preceded by several iterations of a development, tryout, test cycle. After that, we created the complete intervention, which included all 5 text structures and which also involved several iterations of the development cycle, and then the RCT. Meyer's model was aimed at older students. We made many modifications along the way in order to optimize the instruction for our young children. Some changes were quite substantial with respect to formulating the most effective sequence of instructional steps, mapping each individual text structure across the test paragraphs, and ordering the presentation of the 5 structures. We evaluated this final version in a study involving 16 second-grade classrooms in high-poverty schools in New York City. All participants continued to receive their regular reading instruction. Classrooms were randomly assigned to 3 conditions. Students in the CATS condition received the intervention, and in another condition, there was no intervention. The 3rd condition provided a much more stringent control. It was similar to the full CATS intervention in all respects but one. It included the same content, the same materials, book, tasks, tests, the same number of lessons. However, students in this 3rd content condition received no text structure training. We call this the content condition because it focused only on the social studies content. The regular teacher in each classroom did the instruction. We assessed comprehension on the basis of written summaries of paragraphs containing new information about the communities. The CATS students did better than the no intervention students on reporting the main idea and also on including the important information about the main idea. And they were also better at identifying the specific structure of each paragraph. All but one of the comparisons was significant, and that other one was in the predicted direction. Effect sizes ranged from 0.84 to 2.0, and these measures indicated that CATS was successful. We also assessed transfer. There was a sentence completion measure, which we had not used in the training, and that was based on different social studies content, and also 2 measures based on written summaries of natural text taken from authentic reading materials, ill-structured text. All 3 showed significant differences in favor of CATS. The items that were based on natural text showed smaller effect sizes than the others, but they were still substantial. It is difficult to show evidence of transfer to natural text, but I started this project at the time when constructivists were insisting that this was what counted, so we included such items in each of the studies. We also found that the CATS students were superior to the content students on these comprehension measures. In fact, the content students and the no intervention students did not differ. This suggests that explicit and systematic instruction about text structure was necessary. You cannot rely on simple exposure to structured texts if you want to make an impact on children's understanding. How much social studies did the children learn? We gave a vocabulary test, and we also asked questions about what they had learned about the 5 communities. On these measures, the CATS group and the content group did not differ, and both of these groups scored higher than the no treatment group. This means that we were able to embed text structure training in content area instruction without sacrificing acquisition of the academic content. This is important. It would be less than optimal if it turned out that we could improve reading comprehension, but only at the expense of social studies learning. So, I think, at-risk second-grade children can benefit from explicit reading comprehension instruction, and text structure training is an effective vehicle for such instruction. I say this with some confidence because of the content condition in these studies. Without that control, if I had simply run the CATS intervention and a business-as-usual condition, how would I know what made the difference? It could have been the well-scripted lessons, the well-established practices such as read-alouds, vocabulary, and writing, or the carefully crafted texts that we wrote. The basic text templates were very important, but as I pointed out earlier, the results indicated that without the explicit instruction focused on these well-structured paragraphs, the beneficial effects of the instruction would not have occurred. I think I can be sure that it was the text structure instruction that did the trick. I'm somewhat chagrined that nobody seemed to care about the content group. Meta-analyses may or may not include the information, but their focus is on intervention versus business as usual. The What Works Clearinghouse wasn't interested in that condition, but for me, that group is what makes the study interesting. This brings me to my final topic. I want to say a few words about methodology. I have been a big fan of intervention research as it has been shaped and supported by our federal agencies. And I certainly have thought of randomized controlled trials as the gold standard. But as the years go by, I am becoming concerned about where we're heading. One particular concern I have is that people don't pay enough attention to the independent variable in instructional studies. Journal articles usually contain a lengthy description of what the intervention includes, but not of previous interventions that taught the same thing, and how the present intervention differs from previous ones, and why the investigators expect theirs to be better. And articles practically never include discussion of how the present findings compare with those of other studies, except to say, perhaps, we got significant results and a big effect size, or better, we did and they didn't. So what we end up with is a series of studies, mostly undifferentiated, and mostly against business as usual controls, which also vary widely and sometimes are not even described adequately. I wonder whether this is the best way to make progress. Here's another concern. What kinds of questions should we attempt to answer? Our reading interventions are often complex, or at least compound. They rarely involve only one single instructional component. Should we go along with the methodologists, some of whom are eager to develop new analytic techniques to evaluate the relative effectiveness of individual components? I wonder whether we are ready to address this question when we often have not yet established the optimum way to present each one individually. Now for a deeper concern. Over the last few years, as a result of our RCTs started coming in, we discovered that these large, expensive, and difficult to manage studies somehow do not turn out the way we expect them to. Many well-designed and carefully conducted RCTs do not find differences between the outcomes for students who get the intervention and those who do not. And many studies that do find differences only show marginal gains. This is quite distressing. There are indeed many difficulties inherent in conducting intervention research: obtaining cooperation, attrition, the limitation of outcome measures, and the lack of implementation fidelity, which seems to be what gets the most blame when a study fails to find differences. We have to think about how to handle the kinds of results we are seeing. We may have to adjust our expectations. How much of an improvement from having gone through a second-grade vocabulary intervention would be enough for us to declare that that intervention was successful? If the outcome at the end of a year of intervention were 3 months additional gain for the intervention group, would that be enough? The average effect size for large randomized studies is only 0.12, according to Chung and Slavin. Given this, how should we feel about our hallowed 0.05 probability level? It takes huge samples to assure enough power to detect these small effect sizes. Should we change our research conventions? Some investigators have proposed that the conventional significance level be changed to 0.10. Another is that journals jettison significance levels and require only effect sizes with confidence intervals for publication. Some people seem willing to cop out and conduct quasi-experiments and even iffier kinds of correlational studies. I'm no methodologist, and maybe I shouldn't offer an opinion, but I'm going to. I hope that when all the dust settles, we will not end up abandoning the gold standard for silver or bronze. I think that we should remember that while the term randomized controlled trials may originally have been meant to be synonymous with experimental method, the connotations have changed. The experimental method involves first random assignment, accompanied by a data analysis that honors the randomization. That is, it uses the correct unit of analysis. And second, the experimental method involves a control group. Not just any old control group, but one that is designed so that a difference between the outcomes of the two conditions will tell you something important, or at least interesting. But experimental method does not mean mammoth, as you well know, and it does not mean lengthy, complex instructional program. I hope that we recognize that our current conception of an RCT is only one specific variation of the experimental method. Perhaps we should not be doing so many large RCTs. Perhaps we should save this very costly methodology for interventions that have already undergone a lot more developmental work than we require now. If that happens, I sincerely hope that when we do our pilot work for those RCTs, and especially when we undertake other studies for which we have decided that we don't need a full-blown RCT, we opt for real experiments instead of quasis. I've long felt that whoever thought up the name quasi-experiment must have had a background in Madison Avenue. These studies could have been called M&Ms for matching and manipulation, but that's not an experiment. So now I want to go back to reading instruction and sum up. You're all familiar with the interminable war over phonics. We've been relatively at peace for the last few years. Phonics is rather prominent in instruction. It has substantial government support. But there continue to be rumbles from people who disagree. Just a few weeks ago, the International Literacy Association put out a short piece endorsing systematic phonics, and this has provoked considerable heated discourse, which I suspect is going to get even hotter. I don't think the war over phonics instruction is fully over. What about comprehension? I don't think we'll ever go back to what Dolores Durkin described as the mention and test, but don't teach, mode of instruction. Our experience with cognitive strategies and with text structure has made it clear that reading comprehension can be taught, though I am sure there will be some big changes in the way we go about it in the future. But there could be a battle brewing about comprehension in the primary grades, and I hope that this issue gets the attention it deserves. There will be advocates of some form of close reading with a focus on determining the straightforward meaning of ordinary text, on the grounds that without a good foundation in basic reading comprehension, students won't be able to master advanced challenges. I'm firmly of that opinion, in case you hadn't noticed. Others will insist that instruction must feature the new literacy, digital literacy and others, things like that, from the moment children first enter school. Very different elementary curricula are envisioned by proponents of these two positions. I foresee a great deal of debate and perhaps some actual fighting over this. Of course, these reading wars represent the conflict between conservatism and progressivism that was, is, and always will be. Both sides feel that they are working for social justice. In actuality, we need both camps. We need the progressives to innovate and move us forward. We need the traditionalists to ensure that our innovations are not only new, but also solid and substantial. But of course, we also need to know which camp is the one to follow in any given situation, and this is where evidence is so important. Many decades I was perturbed that so many educators ignored evidence. Today I am appalled. I've come to the conclusion that while evidence is necessary, it is not sufficient. First of all, we have to keep reminding people over and over again of what works. This means continuing to collect evidence, not simply to do replications of what we have already done, though that's very important. We also have to design studies that are fresh and current in order to keep up interest and make an impression. We know how difficult it is to change any type of entrenched position. Fortunately, researchers like Pani Condreo in her work on knowledge revision and Gail Sinatra with her refutational texts are dedicating efforts to determining how to overcome this very important problem. But we should also make more of an effort on the dissemination front, really the persuasion front, and give more attention to what is now called social marketing. The goal of social marketing is to convince people to be socially responsible, to protect the environment, to vaccinate children, and so forth. Their strategies should be examined and adopted where feasible to encourage people to be accepting of serious evidence of the effectiveness of instructional methods. We need more and more varied ways of getting our message across. In closing, let me go back to my title. What does educational psychology mean to me? Educational psychology has given me the opportunity to wrestle with questions of theoretical importance that also lead to ways of helping children learn, people learn really, specifically to learn to read, and thereby lead more satisfying and productive lives. I've worked with smart, interesting, and enthusiastic colleagues and students from whom I have learned a great deal. I'm very happy to have chosen a career in this field. In my more philosophical moments, I can even tolerate the ceaseless reading wars. As the great poet John Milton said, rather optimistically, and I quote, "Where there is much desire to learn, there of necessity will be much arguing, much writing, many opinions. For opinion in good persons is but knowledge in the making." Can we move more good people to the opinion that empirical evidence is crucial? That would indeed be knowledge in the making that we desperately need. Thank you for listening, and thank you again for the great honor you've given me.